Chapter 1, Part 3 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 1, The Start, Part 3. Dr. Brazil informed me that the mussurama, like the king snake, was not immune to the colubrine poison. A mussurama in its possession, which had with impunity killed and eaten several rattlesnakes and representatives of the Lachesis genus, also killed and ate a venomous coral snake, but shortly afterward itself died from the effects of the poison. It is one of the many puzzles of nature that these American serpents, which kill poisonous serpents, should only have grown immune to the poison of the most dangerous American poisonous serpents, the pit vipers, and should not have become immune to the poison of the coral snakes, which are commonly distributed throughout their range. Yet, judging by the one instance mentioned by Dr. Brazil, they attack and master these coral snakes, although the conflict in the end results in their death. It would be interesting to find out whether this attack was exceptional, that is, whether the mussurama has or has not, as a species, learned to avoid the coral snake. If it was not exceptional, then not only is the instance highly curious in itself, but it would also go far to explain the failure of the mussurama to become plentiful. For the benefit of those who are not acquainted with the subject, I may mention that the poison of a poisonous snake is not dangerous to its own species unless injected in very large doses, about 10 times what would normally be injected by a bite, but that it is deadly to all other snakes, poisonous or non-poisonous, save as regards the very few species which themselves eat poisonous snakes. The Indian hamadryad, or giant cobra, is exclusively a snake-eater. It evidently draws a sharp distinction between poisonous and non-poisonous snakes, for Mr. Ditmars has recorded that 2 individuals in the Bronx Zoo, which are habitually fed on harmless snakes and attack them eagerly, refused to attack a copperhead which was thrown into their cage, being evidently afraid of this pit viper. It would be interesting to find out if the hamadryad is afraid to prey on all pit vipers, and also whether it will prey on its small relative, the true cobra, for it may well be that, even if not immune to the viper poison, it is immune to the poison of its close ally, the smaller cobra. All these and many other questions would be speedily settled by Dr. Brazil if he were given the opportunity to test them. It must be remembered, moreover, that not only have his researches been of absorbing value from the standpoint of pure science, but that they also have a real utilitarian work. He is now collecting and breeding the mussurama. The favorite prey of the mussurama is the most common and therefore the most dangerous poisonous snake of Brazil, the jararaca, which is known in Martinique as the fer de lance. In Martinique and elsewhere, this snake is such an object of terror as to be at times a genuine scourge. Surely it would be worthwhile for the authorities of Martinique to import specimens of the mussurama to that island. The mortality from snake bite in British India is very great. Surely it would be well worthwhile for the able Indian government to copy Brazil and create such an institute as that over which Dr. Vital Brazil is the curator. At first sight it seems extraordinary that poisonous serpents, so dreaded by and so irresistible to most animals, should be so utterly helpless before the few creatures that prey on them. But the explanation is easy. Any highly specialized creature, the higher its specialization, is apt to be proportionately helpless when once its peculiar specialized traits are effectively nullified by an opponent. This is eminently the case with the most dangerous poisonous snakes. In them a highly peculiar specialization has been carried to the highest point. They rely for attack and defense purely on their poison fangs. All other means and methods of attack and defense have atrophied. They neither crush nor tear with their teeth nor constrict with their bodies. The poison fangs are slender and delicate, and save for the poison, the wound inflicted is of a trivial character. In consequence, they are helpless in the presence of any animal which the poison does not affect. There are several mammals immune to snake bite, including various species of hedgehog, pig, and mongoose. The other mammals which kill them do so by pouncing on them unawares, or by avoiding their stroke through sheer quickness of movement, and probably this is the case with most snake-eating birds. The mongoose is very quick, but in some cases at least, I have mentioned one in the African game trails, it permits itself to be bitten by poisonous snakes, treating the bite with utter indifference. There should be extensive experiments made to determine if there are species of mongoose immune to both cobra and viper poison. Hedgehogs, as determined by actual experiments, pay no heed at all to viper poison, even when bitten on such tender places as the tongue and lips, and eat the snake as if it were a radish. Even among animals which are not immune to the poison, different species are very differently affected by the different kinds of snake poisons. Not only are some species more resistant than others to all poisons, but there is a wide variation in the amount of immunity each displays to any given venom. One species will be quickly killed by the poison from one species of snake and be fairly resistant to the poison of another, whereas in another species the conditions may be directly reversed. The mussurama which Dr. Brazil handed me was a fine specimen, perhaps 4½ feet long. I lifted the smooth, lithe bulk in my hands, and then let it twist its coils so that it rested at ease in my arms. It glided to and fro on its own length, with the sinuous grace of its kind, and showed not the slightest trace of either nervousness or bad temper. Meanwhile, the doctor bade his attendant put on the table a big jararaca, or fer-de-lance, which was accordingly done. The jararaca was about 3 feet and a half, or perhaps nearly 4 feet long. That is, it was about 9 inches shorter than the mussurama. The latter, which I continued to hold in my arms, behaved with friendly and impassive indifference, moving easily to and fro through my hands, and once or twice hiding its head between the sleeve and the body of my coat. The doctor was not quite sure how the mussurama would behave, for it had recently eaten a small snake, and unless hungry, it pays no attention whatever to venomous snakes, even when they attack and bite it. However, it fortunately proved still to have a good appetite. The jararaca was alert and vicious. It partly coiled itself on the table, threatening the bystanders. I put the big black serpent down on the table 4 or 5 feet from the enemy and headed in its direction. As soon as I let go with my hands, it glided toward where the threatening, formidable-looking lance head lay stretched in a half-coil. The mussurama displayed not the slightest sign of excitement. Apparently it trusted little to its eyes, for it began to run its head along the body of the jararaca, darting out its flickering tongue to feel just where it was as it nosed its way up toward the head of its antagonist. So placid were its actions that I did not at first suppose that it meant to attack, but there was not the slightest exhibition of anger or excitement. It was the jararaca that began the fight. It showed no fear whatever of its foe, but its irritable temper was aroused by the proximity and actions of the other, and like a flash it drew back its head and struck, burying its fangs in the forward part of the mussurama's body. Immediately the latter struck in return, and the counter-attack was so instantaneous that it was difficult to see just what had happened. There was tremendous writhing and struggling on the part of the jararaca, and then, leaning over the knot into which the 2 serpents were twisted, I saw that the mussurama had seized the jararaca by the lower jaw, putting its own head completely into the wide gaping mouth of the poisonous snake. The long fangs were just above the top of the mussurama's head, and it appeared, as well as I could see, that they were once again driven into the mussurama, but without the slightest effect. Then the fangs were curved back in the jaw, a fact which I particularly noted, and all effort at the offensive was abandoned by the poisonous snake. Meanwhile, the mussurama was chewing hard and gradually shifted its grip little by little until it got the top of the head of the jararaca in its mouth, the lower jaw of the jararaca being spread out to one side. The venomous serpent was helpless, the fearsome master of the wild life of the forest, the deadly foe of humankind, was itself held in the grip of death. Its cold, baleful serpent's eyes shone, as evil as ever. But it was dying. In vain it writhed and struggled. Nothing availed it. Once or twice the mussurama took a turn round the middle of the body of its opponent, but it did not seem to press hard, and apparently used its coils chiefly in order to get a better grip so as to crush the head of its antagonist, or to hold the latter in place. This crushing was done by its teeth, and the repeated bites were made with such an effort that the muscles stood out on the mussurama's neck. Then it took 2 coils around the neck of the jararaca and proceeded deliberately to try to break the backbone of its opponent by twisting the head round. With this purpose, it twisted its own head and neck round so that the lighter-colored surface was uppermost, and indeed at one time it looked as if it had made almost a complete single spiral revolution of its own body. It never for a moment relaxed its grip except to shift slightly the jaws. In a few minutes the jararaca was dead, its head crushed in, although the body continued to move convulsively. When satisfied that its opponent was dead, the mussurama began to try to get the head in its mouth. This was a process of some difficulty on account of the angle at which the lower jaw of the jararaca stuck out. But finally the head was taken completely inside and then swallowed. After this the mussurama proceeded deliberately, but with unbroken speed, to devour its opponent by the simple process of crawling outside it, the body and tail of the jararaca writhing and struggling until the last. During the early portion of the meal, the mussurama put a stop to this writhing and struggling by resting its own body on that of its prey. But toward the last, the part of the body that remained outside was left free to wriggle as it wished. Not only was the mussurama totally indifferent to our presence, but it was totally indifferent to being handled while the meal was going on. Several times I replaced the combatants in the middle of the table, when they had writhed to the edge, and finally, when the photographers found that they could not get good pictures, I held the mussurama up against a white background with the partially swallowed snake in its mouth, and the feast went on uninterruptedly. I never saw cooler or more utterly unconcerned conduct, and the ease and certainty with which the terrible poisonous snake was mastered gave me the heartiest respect and liking for the easy-going, good-natured, and exceedingly efficient serpent which I had been holding in my arms. Our trip was not intended as a hunting trip, but as a scientific expedition. Before starting on the trip itself, while traveling in the Argentine, I received certain pieces of first-hand information concerning the natural history of the jaguar and of the cougar, or puma, which are worth recording. The facts about the jaguar are not new in the sense of casting new light on its character, although they are interesting, but the facts about the behavior of the puma in one district of Patagonia are of great interest because they give an entirely new side of its life history. There was traveling with me at the time Dr. Francisco P. Moreno of Buenos Aires. Dr. Moreno is at the present day a member of the National Board of Education of the Argentine, a man who has worked in every way for the benefit of his country, perhaps especially for the benefit of the children, so that when he was first introduced to me, it was as the Jacob Riis of the Argentine, for they know my deep and affectionate intimacy with Jacob Riis. He is also an eminent man of science, who has done admirable work as a geologist and a geographer. At one period, in connection with his duties as a boundary commissioner on the survey between Chile and the Argentine, he worked for years in Patagonia. It was he who made the extraordinary discovery in a Patagonian cave of the still fresh fragments of skin and other remains of the Mylodon, the aberrant horse known as the Onohipidium, the huge South American tiger, and the Macroauchenia, all of them extinct animals. This discovery showed that some of the strange representatives of the giant South American Pleistocene fauna had lasted down to within a comparatively few thousand years, down to the time when man, substantially as the Spaniards found him, flourished on the continent. Incidentally, the discovery tended to show that this fauna had lasted much later in South America than was the case with the corresponding faunas in other parts of the world, and therefore it tended to disprove the claims advanced by Dr. Amahino for the extreme age, geologically, of this fauna, and for the extreme antiquity of man on the American continent. One day, Dr. Moreno handed me a copy of The Outlook, containing my account of a cougar hunt in Arizona, saying that he noticed that I had very little faith in cougars attacking men, although I had explicitly stated that such attacks sometimes occurred. I told him, yes, that I had found that the cougar was practically harmless to man, the undoubtedly authentic instances of attacks on men being so exceptional that they could in practice be wholly disregarded. Thereupon, Dr. Moreno showed me a scar on his face and told me that he had himself been attacked and badly mauled by a puma, which was undoubtedly trying to prey on him. That is, which had started on a career as a man-eater. This was, to me, most interesting. I had often met men who knew other men who had seen other men who said that they had been attacked by pumas. But this was the first time that I had ever come across a man who had himself been attacked. Dr. Moreno, as I have said, is not only an eminent citizen, but an eminent scientific man, and his account of what occurred is unquestionably a scientifically accurate statement of the facts. I give it exactly as the doctor told it, paraphrasing a letter he sent me, and including one or two answers to questions I put to him. The doctor, by the way, stated to me that he had known Mr. Hudson, the author of The Naturalist on the Plata, and that the latter knew nothing whatever of pumas from personal experience and had accepted as facts utterly wild fables. Undoubtedly, said the doctor, the puma in South America, like the puma in North America, is, as a general rule, a cowardly animal, which not only never attacks man, but rarely makes any efficient defense when attacked. The Indian and the white hunters have no fear of it in most parts of the country, and its harmlessness to man is proverbial. But there is one particular spot in southern Patagonia where cougars, to the doctor's own personal knowledge, have for years been dangerous foes of man. This curious local change in habits, by the way, is nothing unprecedented as regards wild animals. In portions of its range, as I am informed by Mr. Lord Smith, the Asiatic tiger can hardly be forced to fight man, and never preys on him, while throughout most of its range it is a most dangerous beast, and often turns man-eater. So there are waters in which sharks are habitual man-eaters, and others where they never touch men. And there are rivers and lakes where crocodiles or caimans are very dangerous, and others where they are practically harmless. I have myself seen this in Africa. End of Chapter 1, Part 3.